Well, thank you for coming tonight. We're going to preview Nahum chapter 3, and then I want to go through Babylonian Chronicles. There's several of those covering some years. There's one particular one, Chronicle number 3. I've got a picture of it, and we're going to read through parts of it. That is the Babylonian recording of what they did during the years of the destruction of Nineveh. On the first page, what I've got is a map of Nineveh. You can see how it kind of looks like this coming down. And you've got the Tigris River coming over here. Going through the city is a river called the Kosher River. Comes in, kind of goes up like this and out and flows into the Tigris River like this. And then there is a palace. Well, actually, there's a walled area right there, and there's two palaces in there. You can see the palace of Sanecarib that's identified right here in that walled area, and that's I've showed you pictures of that. In fact, this is right here. These pictures right here are from that palace. They're on the walls of that. They're in the British Museum right now. That's Sennacherib's documenting his last battle in Judah against Lachish. The walls are covered with that information. Following him would be Esarhaddon, and then as king, and then Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal's palace you can see right there, a very luxurious palace, is in that area. Now the scale is at the bottom, 1 mile. You can see this whole area here. This was like a well, like a mile long here. It's probably 3.5 miles, maybe 4 miles around that area. And then you've got the walls of the city. So we talked last week about seeing the chariots coming in. They see them running through the streets. They were in this fortified area here, looking at the destruction going off in the suburbs. And then eventually they're at the wall laying siege. And then they're in here. And then they've got the palace where Ashurbanipal had died at that time. Living there at 612 was Sinshar Ishkun, and these are 3 very weak kings. In fact, he's going to die in the battle that's recorded by the Babylonians. Anyway, you can see that area there, the gates, and how large the city of Nineveh was. This was again built up. It'd been there from the days of Genesis, but it had been built up by Sanecarib during this time period. Because remember, before Tiglath-Pileser, Nineveh had been collapsing in on itself. It wasn't this big, and it began to expand again after that time. Anyway, that's interesting to see that because you can picture it. I've got a little smaller picture at the bottom of page 1, kind of a close-up showing this palace area or the royal area. And within that precinct there is that's where they have the temples. So the temples and the palaces were in this area, and then the common people lived out here. And again, the whole city is full of plunder and treasures that have been taken from their invasions. On that first page, it says there are 4 descriptive declarations of siege against Nineveh. We've read through 2 of them in chapter 1. If you remember, chapter 1 of the book of Nineveh is God describing himself, his jealousy, his wrath that he'd follow with, and then announcing that it is now aimed towards Nineveh and speaks to that. Beginning in chapter 2 and 3, or in chapter 2 and 3, is details of the fall of Nineveh. Within there's going to be some accounts of what they've done wrong. Their sin is going to be mentioned, but there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 actual descriptions of the battle. And we looked at 2 of those last week, chapter 2, verses 3 through 7, and then beginning again in verse 8 through 13, it goes back to this. Again, we're talking, Nahum is speaking in 645 about events that will take place less than 40 years away, and he's describing it prophetically. And then chapter 3 that we'll read through tonight, and we'll come back next week and fill in some detail. You've got chapter 3 verses 1 through 7 is the 3rd description of the same battle, and then beginning in verse 8 we go back and we describe it again, putting details in that. So if you would, you could take your notes if you want to and go to page 6. I've started on these notes, but I'm not finished with them. I'm going to do more with them for next week. But what it begins, at the very top, you can see where it says chapter 6, or page 6 at the top of page 6, Nahum chapter 3, verse 1. In the English Standard Version, in the notes, it says, "Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey." And that verse, it ends by saying, there's no end to the prey, or the NIV says, never without victims. That may tie into, and some people even put chapter 3, verse 1 with the end of chapter 2, because there, we'll go back, if you look in your text of the scriptures in your Bible, chapter 2, verse 11, we start talking about the lion's den. And that lion's den would be this area right here. The lion's den. This is where the royalty lived, within the palace precincts where the temples were, the palaces were. The king of Assyria, especially Ashurbanipal, is pictured many times killing lions, and they refer to themselves as the lion. They are the great lion, similar to the lion of the tribe of Judah. But this right here is where the lion lives. This is where his cubs are at. And in chapter 2, the end of chapter 2, beginning in verse 11, here now is the lion's den. And probably speaking of this area right here you see on your map, the place where they fed their young, and the lion and lioness went, and the cubs with nothing to fear. And again, this is, as you can see on the map again, Nineveh's far away from all Judah, Egypt, many of the places they plundered. And then when they get to Nineveh, it's surrounded by a huge walled city behind these more secure walls within the palace, which is a fortress. And so there's nothing to fear. This is where the lion, Ashurbanipal, these other kings would go. Their cubs, the lionesses, would go without nothing to fear. The lion killed enough for his cubs and strangled the prey for his mate, filling his lairs with kill and his dens with prey. And that's when they'd go off and they'd plunder. That was their part of their economy. We talked about they'd go off and plunder, bring all that treasure back here. It's described as flesh. But then in verse 13, God says here, and he's going to say it several times, well, a couple more times here. He says, "I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty, Yahweh. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard." And that's kind of where we ended last week. Remember, chapter 2 begins with the good news on the mountaintop, in contrast with Assyria's Sanecarib sending off his field marshal and them sending their messengers around the Middle East. They're never going to be heard again. Chapter 3 begins, "Woe to the city of blood," again Nineveh. This is now going to start the third wave of describing the destruction. It describes the problem with the city. 4 things: city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims in the NIV, or in the NIV, a bloody city full of lies, full of plunder, and full of prey or victims. And that would be in here. That's the problem. They brought all this plunder back. And now, beginning in chapter, I'm going to just read off the notes here in the English Standard. This first section, the crack of the whip, and this is the third account of the destruction of Nineveh by the Babylonians in 612. The crack of the whip, the rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and bounding chariot. Again, that describes last week we saw like flashing lights going around through the streets of the city. Horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain. Now it describes in 3, we'll get more details next week, in 3 different words, hosts of slain, heaps of corpse, dead bodies without end. There's 3 words describing it. And then it says they stumble over the bodies. And each of those phrases or words describes something unique about the dead bodies, including if they're laying face down or whatever. But the ideal is this is just full of dead bodies. Dead bodies without end. They stumble over the bodies. Now, we'll talk about that. Who's stumbling? Is it the Babylonians who are invading, stumbling over carcasses? Or is it those trying to escape, stumbling over the corpses? But there's so many of them. Chapter 3, verse 4. And all for the countless whorings of the prostitute. This is again, why are there dead bodies all over Nineveh? All for the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. Meaning they brought everybody into their fold, tricked them, used their whoredoms on them, and brought them into their submission. And that's why God's against them. Now he says in verse 5, again, Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. Again, this is the second time we've heard it tonight. Declares the Lord of hosts. I will lift up your skirts over your face. I will make the nations look at your nakedness and the kingdoms at your shame. I will throw filth at you and treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. Again, this great city who thinks they're safe, ruling the whole world. God is saying almost 40 years before they fell that you're going to be an embarrassment. Everyone's going to look at you and be ashamed that they even were associated with you. I'll make you a spectacle. Verse 7, and all who look at you will shrink from you and say, wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? In other words, when you fall, anyone that you had lured into your whoredoms, they're all going to just step back and say, who cares? We're free. Just like Judah, good news on the mountaintops. It's going to be like that throughout the empire. And then begins the fourth and final of the declarations against Nineveh. And we talked about this, Thebes, which was destroyed in 663 back here. Earlier in Ashurbanipal's 5th year, he went down to Egypt, way deep into Egypt, and destroyed Thebes. So what he has done to Thebes is going to be done similar to Nineveh. So these are a comparison. And Thebes, well, it's going to describe it for us here. Are you better than Thebes? Speaking of Nineveh, meaning they think they're safe. Well, so did Thebes. Are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile? She's got a river around her, with water around her, circled herself in water. Her rampart is a sea, and that sea is talking about the Nile River, which was, like half a mile or more across. Her rampart is sea, and water as her wall. So she had herself protected in fortresses and walls, but also the water was her key element of protection. Cush was her strength. Let's talk about countries around her. Egypt too, and that without limit. Put and the Libyans were her helpers. There's no way Thebes is going to fall. But yet Ashurbanipal, the great king, did defeat them early in his reign. And now it says in verse 10, yet she became an exile. She went into captivity. And in her battle, her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street. For her honored men, lots were cast. And this is what happens. Infants were dashed to pieces. They didn't need the infants because that would just be a burden to take care of. So they were killed as they gathered up people, killed in the streets, in the corners of the intersections at the center, wherever they gathered them, at the head of every street. For her honored men, lots were cast. Now the honored men, they're going to want to use those, keep those, use them for trophies. And they would cast lots, gamble for who gets which of the noble men, the honored men. And all her great men were bound in chains. So they didn't need the infants, so they killed the babies. But the men that were honored and worthy of being sold or gambled for, they were sold for lots and put in chains. Now they go from talking about Thebes, what happened down Thebes. That's what Ashurbanipal did. I mean, the wickedness and corruption, the bloodshed of the Assyrians was astounding. I even came across more things that they did as I was reading this week, that just the cruelty they would do to people. And you can see a little bit of it here. Now it's going to turn on them. Chapter 3, verse 11. You also will be drunken. And now drunken, it could refer to wine, or it could refer to just being out of tune, out of touch with what's going on around them. It's going to appear they're going to be surprised to some extent about what's taking place and not be ready for it. They're not going to be able to defend themselves. So they too will be drunk, at least not awake, not alert. You will go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. And as this happens, this whole thing that's going to take place is going to fall in 3 months. When the Assyrians came against Shalmaneser and Sargon, we say it's fell. Shalmaneser is what who destroyed Samaria, northern Israel, but actually it was Sargon. They're both, because Shalmaneser led the first 2.5, first 2 3/4 of a year. Then he died, and Sargon was one who finished the battle and deported the people. Shalmaneser began it. But it was a 3-year siege for Samaria to fall at the hands of Shalmaneser and Sargon after the mighty king Tiglath-Pileser had ruled and reigned. So 3 years for that. It's going to take the Babylonians several months to lay siege and destroy Jerusalem. It took the Romans 3 years to destroy the Jews in the Jewish wars. this, they're going to collapse in 3 months. So you can see they're really on a decline. It's interesting to see the decline here, but right before this rise, this was Jonah telling them that they're going to be destroyed. They were given a reprieve, and they went right back into their position. Nonetheless, chapter 3, verse 11, you also will be drunken. You will go into hiding. You will seek refuge from the enemy. Verse 12, all your fortresses are like fig trees with first ripe figs. If shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. So all the fortresses you can see on your map, the details of all the walls and the gates, the towers protecting the city, everything's going to fall. It's going to be a perfect time. Everything's going to collapse. Behold your troops. This is going to describe the troops. Behold your troops are women in your midst. The idea there is you want manly men guarding your city, but your manly men, it's like having women on the wall. It's like they're not the ones you want fighting for the city. I mean, it's completely contrary to the way we think in America, in our postmodern culture, that, well, women can do the same thing as a man. They can kick footballs and do that, all that, that latest women thing. But here's the point is, these troops, these mighty Assyrian troops that you can see here, impaling people, carrying the enemy's heads, skinning people alive, and had conquered the Middle East. At this time, at this point in history, they're no better than having your city defended by women. And that's not an insult to women. That's just saying they're not mighty warriors anymore. This decline is serious. Ashurbanipal was powerful. Halfway through about 630, the decline had fully set in, and these guys have nothing left to defend themselves with. In fact, there's troops, Nahum is describing them as women trying to defend the city. And it's amazing how a culture can go from being mighty warriors to just, unable to defend themselves. The gates of your land are wide open to your enemies. Fire has devoured your bars. Draw water for the siege. And this is talking to the people in here. In other words, get ready. Draw water for the siege. You got to get some water, get some food, get ready, because you're going to be locked up in the city as they beat on your walls. Draw water for the siege. Strengthen your forts. Go into the clay. Tread the mortar. In other words, they're walking on the mortar, the clay, getting things ready to pack up against the wall so they can't collapse. Take hold of the brick mold. In other words, start reinforcing your walls as they collapse, because they're outside banging against them. They're going to start trying to prop them back up on the inside. As they're knocking them out from the outside, they're trying to rebuild them from the inside. There will the fire devour you. While you're trying to hold your walls together on the inside, there the fire will devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. In other words, your last thing you'll be doing is starting to try to reinforce your walls, getting the mortar and the clay ready, trying to hold your walls up. That's the last thing you're going to do, because that's where you're going to die, trying to reinforce your walls. Multiply yourself like locusts, multiply like grasshopper. And this is talking about the people again. We're going back and forth between the siege and their guilt or their sin, the things they've done wrong. Because this is a guilty city. And what they've done, this is happening to them on these walls because they multiplied themselves. They multiplied like locusts. And now in verse 16, 17, and 18, you've got several classes of people in Nineveh, and this is what they're described like. They've increased like locusts, these people, the Ninevites, the Assyrians. Chapter 3, verse 16, you increased your merchants more than the stars of heaven. The locust spreads its wings and flies away. So this place is full of merchants. People come bringing here selling stuff. The shops are open. Everything's a business. There's they've multiplied their merchants. All kinds of things are being shipped in to be sold. This is where all the money's at. This is the hub. But when this day begins to happen, these merchants, these locusts that have multiplied in the city, they spread their wings and fly away. These merchants are gone, either fleeing or running or being cut down. That's what happens to the merchants. Your princes are like grasshoppers, running, hiding, hopping away. Your scribes are like clouds of locusts, settling on the fences in the day of cold. When the sun rises, they fly away. No one knows where they are. So all these things that they've got in the city are disappearing. The merchants are gone. The princes are gone. Your nobles are gone. Your scribes are gone. Verse 18, your shepherds, they're asleep. Now the shepherds would be the leaders, and we've already seen this already, is that the king says, well, I got defendants earlier in chapter 2. I've got warriors here stationed. Get ready. And they stumble over each other, going to the wall to get ready. Because as they're inside here for protection, this place is already being overrun out here in the suburbs, and they're going to the wall to get ready, stumbling on each other. That's chapter 2. Well, here it says, your shepherds, your leaders, are asleep, O king of Assyria. In other words, he calls them, but they're asleep. Your nobles slumber. Your peoples are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. So you got the different classes of the merchants, the princes, the scribes. They're fleeing, scattering. They're getting out of town. The people that are there to shepherd the people and fight for the people, they're asleep. They're unaware. And what results? The people that were there buying the merchandise, being protected by the king and the government, they're now scattered on the mountains and no one to gather them. They're never coming back again. Now we have one last verse in the book of Nahum. It's the final description of their fate, and then a rhetorical question that God asked them about, again, combining their destruction with their guilt. This is a guilty people. They've done things, they deserve this. Like, well, you feel sorry for them. Why would that happen to people? Well, they've gone, so God does not leave the guilty unpunished. He's slow, the book begins, but he doesn't leave them unpunished. They're guilty. He's allowed them to prosper and enjoy these things, hoping they would come back or they would return around. But they've gone so far that now it's time to punish the guilty. So they're going to be destroyed, and they're guilty. This is what this last verse says. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. Talking to Nineveh. In other words, there's no ending it. You've been defeated. Your wound is complete. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you. Now, that may be thought of as applause, or it may be a sign of mourning. Depends on what. In America, we clap our hands for a great play. Some of that would be like part of the mourning process, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this has happened. And they hear, their wound is grievous. People clap their hands over hearing the fall of Nineveh. And here's the rhetorical question. For on whom has not come your unceasing evil? For whom? Name someone on this map that didn't suffer because of you. You can't. Everyone on this map suffered because of you, the Assyrians. And so your wound now is total. It's complete. And all who hear about it are clapping their hands. Either as a sign of applause, welcoming it, or as part of the mourning process of, oh my gosh, how grievous is that? So we'll come back and fill in some details about that next week. What I want to do now is go to page 2, because this is, interesting. I hope you find it interesting. I'm not sure how long this will take. But there you see on page 2, you see it's Chronicle 3. Chronicle 3, it's written in cuneiform writing. It's of the part of the Babylonian Chronicles. The Babylonian Chronicles are documentation of the things that take place. You can see right there between 747 and 282 BC. So this is during the days of the Assyrians, going up until the time of the Greeks have come in, and they begin reigning. So they're not all written at the same time, but there are the historical collection of details and information. And many of them are copied over and over. Ashurbanipal, because they began back in 747, he's going to have scribes copying the Babylonian Chronicles as he collects them. He's going to take them here and have them collected. One of the things I was reading this week about his scribes that he collects, that they're put under bondage, and they're scribes, but they've got just enormous amounts of writing they've got to get done as they're taking things from one language, translating them to another language that the people can read, or making copies of taking Babylonian copies and making copies for Ashurbanipal's library, which was found there. You can see where his palace is. It was found, and it was just volumes, some 6,000 volumes of these clay tablets. This one is, again, the Babylonian account. Oh, I was going to tell you, one of the Babylonian accounts from Nebuchadnezzar's time, this comes from, this one right here is for the years 615, the one we're looking at, Chronicle 3, from 615 to 609. This is the Babylonian, just their highlights of what's going on in those years. And as you can see, 612 is the fall of Nineveh. So within there, we're going to see their account of this event. Not necessarily the day by day, but it's broken down. These years are broken down on this tablet. So we'll be able to read about their account of what takes place here that Nahum prophesied around 645. But we got within these tablets, the Babylonian Chronicles. It's a large collection of clay tablets. Includes one that's flat out amazing. Is, if you don't mind me going back, Josiah, the king, right here, Josiah, right here, Josiah. He's killed in 609, and following him is going to be Jehoahaz, and he's going to be taken to Egypt. He'll be replaced by Jehoiakim and set up by Nebuchadnezzar as king. Jehoahaz goes to Egypt, taken by Necho because he didn't do his job. Jehoiakim is set up by Nebuchadnezzar, and at some point Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a setback, and Jehoiakim is going to join in a rebellion. He's going to end up dying and being thrown over the wall. They didn't even have a burial for him. This is one son, two sons, and then Jehoiakim is a teenager. He's like 18 years old. When his father dies, Jehoiachin is Jehoiakim's son. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes to attack Jehoiakim, but he's already dead. So Nebuchadnezzar takes Jehoiachin, just as a teenager. He reigns for 3 months. Takes him back to Babylon. Keep that in mind. As a teenager, he's taken. He didn't get to do anything. And sets up his uncle, Zedekiah, as the king. And this would be Josiah's 1, 2, 3 sons. Jehoahaz, who went to Egypt, Jehoiakim, who ends up dying, and Zedekiah, the last king, who's taken by Nebuchadnezzar back to Babylon after he puts out, and Jeremiah told him, you will go to Babylon, but you won't see it. That was the prophecy. Because Zedekiah was captured, fleeing at the fall of Jerusalem, and was taken up to Carchemish to meet with, or in that northern area, up where Nebuchadnezzar is going to be stationed up there while Jerusalem is being destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to be taken up there, captured along with his sons, and Nebuchadnezzar has Zedekiah's sons killed in front of him, and then gouges out his eyes, and takes Zedekiah as a prisoner back to Babylon. Okay? Now, what we're interested in is Jehoiachin. Because Jehoiachin was taken back, was put in prison. One of the kings that follows, this Amel Marduk, would that be who it was? I'm trying to think. I thought it might be him. Or after him. One of these kings, during these years of revolt, as they're declining, he was put in prison and then was released and took the crown, took the throne. And he also took Jehoiachin, who was in prison for a while, took him out of prison and set him at the table. It says in the Bible that he ate at the king's table, him and his family. He had a wife, he had children there in Babylon captivity. And he ate, the Bible says he ate at the king's table in Babylon. After he went to prison, he was released and welcomed into the palace. He's going to have a son, who's going to have a son, who's going to have a son, who's going to be Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel is going to be the one who helps rebuild the temple and becomes the governor of Jerusalem, comes back from Babylon, becomes the governor of Jerusalem for the Persians. He does not become the king because after Zedekiah, the line of David is cursed and cut off right there. No longer will this line sit on the throne. And that's where you've got to go back to Solomon and get Solomon's son Nathan, or David's son Nathan, because Solomon's line is cut off. Remember we talked eschatology? David had a covenant that he'll always have a son on the throne, unconditional. Solomon's covenant, God says, as long as you obey me, you'll have a son sitting on my throne. That was a conditional promise, very clear in Scripture. Solomon, his sons, and Solomon himself were wicked, and Solomon's line was cut off. So this whole thing is eliminated, going back to Solomon, but we still got the Davidic covenant that David would always have a son on the throne. So you go back to David, and through Nathan, David's son, you get Jesus, the Messiah, who will reign forever. Jesus does not come through Solomon as much as... there's an overlap in genealogies as it goes. But nonetheless, my point, Jehoiachin, according to the scriptures, Josiah's grandson, the son of Jehoiakim, who was taken along with Ezekiel in 597, they have, one of the Babylonian Chronicles has recorded on there Jehoiachin's name and the allotment of food that was given to him, and those who were in his household is recorded on something just like this. Name's Jehoiachin, and that he's in Babylon, he's at the king's table, and the food that was provided for him. So just very interesting there that this guy shows up in these chronicles, and that he's in the same place doing the same thing that the Bible says he was supposed to be doing. Now, this right here is Chronicle 3. There's a translation written here. You can see how big it is. It's 132 millimeters long and 69 millimeters wide. So we're not talking about big stones. These things, when you go to the museum and look at them, they're small things. They're the things that the scribes would hold in their hand, and then they'd with wet clay, they'd have a stylus that's kind of wedged. The point of their stylus, again, this is enlarged, would look something like this. You know, this would be solid right there. And so they'd press it like this to press it in to get that image and that image, or they could press it like this, or they could get just a line, and that's how they'd make their letters with this. And I've got a video, and you may have seen it too. I've seen a video, I don't have it, I've seen it, of someone writing cuneiform in a clay, and when you start, just like you can write letters quickly, they would just write these things out. You can see the wedge-shaped writings that they're using the stylus to make these. So these things would fit in your hand, and then you could read it on this. From this, they're going to go to the cylinders where they're going to roll it, be able to roll around, look at it. What I want to do is point this out. I can tell you this was translated by such and so. On page 3, the translation begins here. And I've added when it tells, like, it begins by saying, the 10th year of Nabopolassar. Here's Nabopolassar. In 626, he drives, or he unites the Chaldean tribes, and he begins driving out and fighting the Babylonians, or the Assyrians who down there are controlling Babylon. And he begins driving them out and fighting them. It takes him a period of time. Give him about 10 years. Within 10 years, he's got the Assyrians on the run, and by 612, he's crushing their capital. So Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's dad, was himself a brilliant warrior, brilliant king. Nonetheless, it says in the 10th year, 616, 615, and again, that doesn't mean they're not sure. That our 12-month year is different than their 12-month year. Our 12-month year, if we would say 615, they would have to say, then you got a Hebrew calendar, you've got a Babylonian or Chaldean calendar, you got the English calendar. It gives you the month. Nabopolassar mustered the army of Akkad. And Akkad is the Babylonians. Akkad, that was the people that he defeated. They're also the Chaldeans. They're coming from the land of Chaldea. We know them as the Babylonians. So when it talks about Akkad, that's the people from down there in that area. It's the tribal group down there, depending on what you're going to call it. So he gets his army together and marched along the bank of the Euphrates. You can see the Euphrates coming up the Euphrates. The Suhians and the Hindanians, people living south of Haran. So you've got Haran sitting right there. They're south, so he's marching up towards them. Did not do battle against them, but placed their tribute before him. Just like Alexander conquered from the east, when he began to conquer, people just opened their gates up and gave him tribute and welcomed him and joined his army. As he goes up here, these people south of Haran, they didn't fight him, they just joined him. So he's attacking, but his army's growing just because the people are tired of the Assyrians. They're ready for a new leader. And he goes on and talks about, in the month of Abu, the army of Assyria prepared for battle. And Nabopolassar went up against them on the 12th of the month. He did battle against the army of Assyria, and the army of Assyria retreated before him. So he's going up the Euphrates, The people join him. The Assyrians come out to fight him, and he fights back, and they start fleeing. They're fleeing back into Nineveh, so he's coming. And there's even got the date, July 4th, 616, on the 12th of the month Abu. It continues. You can read more details about that. Go down to Y11. It says, in the 11th year, 615, 614, the king of Akkad, that would be Nabopolassar, mustered his army and marched along the bank of the Tigris. Now, a year later, he's going to go up the Tigris. And that's 615, 614. It talks about what he does there. He camped against Ashur, one of the cities there. Tells you, they pushed the king of Akkad back from Ashur and marched after him as far as another city there. Then down toward the bottom of page 3. This is all on that little tablet. 614, 613. The Medes, after they marched against Nineveh, hastened and they captured Tarbisu. Now coming over here, joining him, and we haven't mentioned this, but the Medes are going to join Nabopolassar, and they're going to attack Nineveh together. Turn the page 4. You got Y13 at the top of the page. That's the 13th year of Nabopolassar. So the Suhians rebelled against the king of Akkad and became belligerent. The king of Akkad, Nabopolassar, mustered his army and marched to Suhu on the 4th day of the month, May 11th, 613. He did battle against them, and the city is on the island in the middle of the Euphrates. And at that time he captured the city. He's continuing. Y14, the 14th year, 612, 611. Now we're moving in on Nineveh. This is the Babylonian record. It says the king of Akkad, that'd be Nabopolassar, mustered his army and marched to Assyria. The king of the Medes marched towards the king of Akkad, and they met one another. They're going down. The Medes are joining the Babylonians. The king of Akkad and his army crossed the Tigris. Cyaxares had to cross. That's the king of the Medes that joined him, and they marched along the bank of the Tigris in the month of Samanu. They encamped against Nineveh. Now we're caught up. This is what Nahum said in 645 was going to happen. The Persians have joined with the Babylonians, or the Medes have joined with the Akkads. From the month of Samanu until the month of Abu, for 3 months. That's the siege. For 3 months, they subjected the city to a heavy siege. This is against Nineveh. On the whatever day of the month Abu, they inflicted a major defeat upon a great people. At that time, Sinsar-Uskan, that's this guy right here, Sinsar-Uskan, king of Assyria, died. They carried off the vast booty of the city and the temple and turned the city into a ruined heap. They of Assyria escaped from the enemy, and to save his life, seized the feet of the king of Akkad. And so one of these people, we talk about the nobles fleeing, the merchants fleeing, this individual came to Nabopolassar and grabbed his feet and surrendered and asked for mercy. On the 20th day of the month, September 14th, 612, Cyaxares, that would be the king of the Medes, and his army went home. Battle's over. Their enemy has been defeated. They're no longer worried. They're going home. They've got peace on their eastern front, or western front. After he had gone, the king of Akkad, Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's dad, dispatched his army, and they marched to Nisabina, plunder and exiles, and they brought the people of Rashapa to the king of Akkad at Nineveh. So Nabopolassar stays in Nineveh. What's left there is camp, and the people are now chasing. Remember, Assyrians the government moves with a dead king. They got a new king now, so he died in 612. Ashur-ubal, he takes what's left, and they go to Haran, and Nabopolassar's army follows them to Haran. And he's going to meet them in 610, and Haran falls in 610. Ashur-uballit, that's this guy right here, mentions him right here on the text. I lost my place. Ascended to the throne in Haran to rule Assyria. I mean, what's left of Assyria? I mean, nothing's left. People have retreated, it's gone, but they've got their government together in Haran. Up until the day of the month, the king of Akkad set out and in whatever. And then in the 15th year, 611, in the month of Duz, he talks about him, he marched to Assyria victoriously. He marched about and plundered and carried off its vast booty. He continues to chase them until finally he goes back home. And by 605, the one who's leading the battle, the general in all of this, besides Nabopolassar being with his army, is his son Nebuchadnezzar. And 609, 605, Nebuchadnezzar's up here fighting. And then he defeats the Assyrians and chases Pharaoh Necho back to Egypt. In 605, that's when he hears reports that Nabopolassar is dead. And now he's got to get back. And that's when he takes Daniel captive. And he's got to get back over this whole area and set up his kingdom, because he's got brothers who would try to take the throne, and he's got to get over there and establish himself. And that's when he has the dream of the statue, and Daniel interprets it there in 605. So that's all taking place, and many of these things are recorded right here. I thought you would find that interesting. On page 5 at the bottom, I just copied and pasted this from the Britannica. It talks about similar things there, some other information. Sometimes more in an updated fashion as far as words and terminology. But that is the historical account as close as we can come. It's the Babylonian account of what Nahum said was going to happen. And it's taken right out of the Chronicles of Nineveh. I guess that's what I wanted to share with you tonight, get some background on it. We'll finish up the book of Nahum next week. So I'm not sure what time it is. Wow, that's awful early. I can't quit. I got 16 minutes. What do I do? I'll pray. And you got a question?
How far is it from Nineveh to Babylon?
I do not know that. You should Google it. I'd Google it right now. I don't know the exact mileage. But I think if I remember right, when Nebuchadnezzar was coming down here, as he's chasing Pharaoh Necho back down into Egypt, and he hears that his father's dead, he rounds up some of the royal children from Jerusalem. He goes, you can't go across here because it's the desert, so you got to go up and come down the river. He makes that journey in 7 days. He's back within a week, back in Babylon, or back in where the throne's at, because he's concerned. So I don't know off the top of my head how far it is. I'll pray, and then I'll let you go, and I'm going to throw something at you I've been thinking about today. Father, we do thank you for the chance to look into these things. I again ask that we would be a people that would be wise in our own days, that we would see our own age and do the things that are right in your eyes, but also do things that are wise, so that we are aware of what's going on in our own world. We do thank you again for the scriptures, and ask that you lead and guide each one of us to become the people you've called us to be. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for your time.